In April 1975, Cambodia was seized in a violent coup by the communist regime known as the Khmer Rouge. Over the next 4 years, nearly 3 million Cambodians were tortured, starved, and murdered. One man stood behind it all, a genocidal ruler who was as mysterious as he was ruthless: Pol Pot, one of the world's most elusive dictators. Join us as we unveil the man behind the persona and the events that drove him to darkness. How did Pol Pot evade justice? And why does Cambodia's nightmare remain widely unknown? This is not a rags to riches story, and the boy who would one day become a murderous dictator was not a rural peasant. His real name was Saloth Sar. He was born in 1925 in northeastern Cambodia, the 8th of 9 children. His older brother described Saloth Sar as a polite boy who never caused trouble. His parents were wealthier than most, owning over 20 acres of rice land. At age 6, Saloth Sar moved to the capital of Cambodia, Phnom Penh. There, he would live with his cousin, who was the king's consort. Saloth Sar found himself far from the rice fields surrounded by Cambodia's elite. It is even rumored that he lost his virginity to one of the king's concubines. These were privileged beginnings, but a recurring problem would force the young Saloth Sar on a path that would have catastrophic consequences for the country he claimed to love. Saloth Sar was plagued by academic difficulties. He was held back 2 years in primary school and failed his upper high school entrance exams. Unable to keep up with his classmates and having little choice, Saloth Sar entered carpentry school. It was a different social group, and it's hard to say how he reacted because he didn't stay very long. Saloth Sar unexpectedly received a scholarship to a school in Paris. The experience should have provided Saloth with an appreciation for France, but he was seduced by something else entirely. It wasn't a place, but a cause. When Saloth Sar arrived in Paris in the late 1940s, he didn't bask in the history and culture. Instead, he was recruited by a clandestine group known as the Cercle Marxiste, France's underground communist circle. Like many Cambodians, Saloth Sar wished for his country to be an independent national state, and communism offered simple answers to complex problems. Despite Saloth Sar's intellectual weaknesses, he attracted mentors like Jacques Duclos, leader of the French Communist Party. This must have provided Saloth Sar with a sense of intellectual validation. He later admitted that he struggled to comprehend or even completely read Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. Still, he was obsessed with the ideology and hosted fervent study circles. 3 years later, Saloth Sar would return to Cambodia, determined to reshape its future. But the country he found was not the one he remembered. In 1953, Cambodia was on the brink of civil war, with once prosperous families plunged into destitution, including Saloth Sar's own. King Sihanouk's rule had grown tyrannical and ineffective. He declared independence from France, an act that should have been celebrated, but only fueled political instability and unrest. Anti-Sihanouk groups and pro-Western forces openly criticized the king. Saloth Sar aligned himself with a third faction, the Khmer Viet Minh, known for their use of guerrilla tactics in resistance efforts. Though, with only 5,000 members, they weren't exactly capable of toppling a government. Saloth Sar would also join the Communist Party of Kampuchea. His unwavering ideological zeal, organizational skills, and ability to inspire loyalty propelled him to the forefront, eventually making him a leader. Saloth Sar recognized the importance of broad appeal, and the elite class held the promise of credibility and influence. But Saloth Sar had to avoid raising suspicion from the anti-communist Sihanouk. Despite lacking formal credentials, Saloth Sar secured a prestigious teaching position at a private school where he taught literature and, ironically, morals. As a teacher, he was shielded from scrutiny. Support for the Communist Party poured in. The rural class yearned for land reform, while students and intellectuals were captivated by the promise of radical social change and equality. Professionals saw the CPK as a solution to government corruption. Sihanouk, aware of the CPK's growing influence, censored them, suppressed their media coverage, and even derided them as the Khmer Rouge, or Red Cambodians. But the scorn only bolstered support. So Sihanouk would take a drastic measure to dismantle the Communist Party, and Salawat Shah's response would set in motion a transformation that would propel him from political activist to genocidal dictator. In February of 1962, anti-government protests prompted Sihanouk to dismiss the existing government. Sham elections followed, with left-leaning figures summoned to meet with Sihanouk. As the main figurehead of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, Salawat Shah was included. Recognizing the encounter's significance, Salawat Shah refused to attend, opting instead to flee deep into the Cambodian jungle near Viet Cong encampments along the South Vietnam border. It was a primal place that the man known as Salawat Shah would never return from. In the Cambodian jungle, Salawat Shah endured nearly a decade of relentless hardship, scarcity of resources, and constant danger. He witnessed the brutal tactics of the Viet Cong, ambushes, bombings, and hit-and-run assaults. Fear was the hallmark of order, loyalty was often tested, and violence justified. Salawat Shah transformed from ideologue to militarized radical and emerged as the leader of the Khmer Rouge. To mark the change, he would adopt a name derived from the French phrase politique potentielle, Pol Pot. The militant group grew in number, and with it, the belief that rapid social and political change could only be achieved through armed conflict. They only needed a spark, and it was President Nixon that handed it to them. In 1969 and 1970, President Richard Nixon's bombing campaigns aimed at disrupting Viet Cong supply lines unintentionally displaced thousands of Cambodians. Then, in March of 1970, a coup by Western forces led by General Lon Nol ousted Norodom Sihanouk from power. Sihanouk, in his quest to regain control, would ally himself with the Khmer Rouge, whose ranks now boasted a formidable 65,000 fighters. On April 17, 1975, the Khmer Rouge seized the capital of Cambodia. The civil war was finally over, yet what should have been a day of liberation and hope quickly turned into a living nightmare. Upon seizing control of Cambodia, Pol Pot immediately implemented his vision of agrarian socialism. Contact with the outside world was severed, and radical measures were instituted. Major urban areas were evacuated. Doctors, accountants, and other urban professionals, once courted by the communists, were now transplanted to farms, where they endured grueling labor. In the pursuit of higher food production, worker rations were cut, and workload increased, leading to starvation, disease, and ultimately death. Those who resisted faced torture or re-education camps. The regime was suspicious, hostile, and relentlessly hunted dissidents. Pol Pot, who once masked himself as an intellectual, now targeted anyone who exhibited a mere hint of intellectualism, like wearing glasses, for instance. It was a regime whose killing knew no bounds. Detention centers, like the notorious S21, demonstrate the boundless cruelty and inhumanity of Pol Pot's atrocities. Here, an estimated 20,000 prisoners, which included women and children, were forced to confess to crimes and betray their families. Only a handful survived. The horrors Pol Pot inflicted on his own country only came to light in 1979 as the regime crumbled. The discovery of shallow graves exposed the extent of suffering. Known as the Killing Fields, they are a haunting testament to unchecked power and radical ideologies. From 1975 to 1979, Close to 3 million Cambodians, almost a quarter of the country's population, died under the rule of Pol Pot. It is a period that haunts Cambodia and its people, even today. Pol Pot was never made to answer for his crimes and avoided capture until his death in 1998. Some speculate he died of cancer, while others suggest suicide by poison. A final mystery from the man who orchestrated Cambodia's darkest chapter. So, why does Pol Pot remain widely unknown? One reason is that he was a master of secrecy and managed to stay out of the public eye. Even his family was unaware of his true identity until a photo of the dictator was revealed in 1979. It could be that the Cambodian people would prefer to heal, rebuild, and move forward. A choice to move past painful memories. Perhaps it is the complexity of the story, where the historical and political nuance of Cambodia's genocide is difficult to capture. Nevertheless, evil must be brought out from the shadows. There is little doubt that the history of Pol Pot provides a solemn call for the remembrance of those affected, but also a stark warning against the seductive allure of radical ideologies.